What would you do if every mistake you made cost you blood? In the unforgiving Wild West, justice was harsh, swift, and merciless. Lawbreakers faced punishments that were as brutal as the crimes they committed, or sometimes worse. Imagine a world where a stolen horse could cost you your life, where public floggings were just the beginning, and where some were tortured in ways so horrifying they became tales of legend. This was a land without mercy, where survival often depended on fear and retribution. But how far did the frontier's justice go, and who held the power to enforce such savage penalties? Join us as we uncover the 15 most brutal punishments of the Wild West, revealing the grim and bloody consequences of stepping out of line. 15. Hanging or lynching. Kicking off our list is a punishment synonymous with the Wild West: hanging, or more chillingly, lynching. This grim practice claimed countless lives and became a hallmark of frontier justice. In the lawless lands of the Wild West, trials were rare luxuries, and justice was often executed swiftly by vigilante mobs acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Public hangings weren't merely methods of execution, they were community events. Crowds gathered with morbid curiosity to witness the condemned face their final moments. Suspects, sometimes guilty of theft or murder, but just as often accused based on rumor or circumstance, were dragged to the nearest tree or gallows. The rope was placed around their necks, and they were hoisted into the air. The result was rarely instantaneous. Many victims died agonizingly slow deaths from suffocation, their desperate kicks painting a harrowing picture of suffering. Particularly horrifying were lynchings, which added a layer of racial terror to this form of punishment. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, estimates that from 1889 to 1922, around 3,500 African Americans were lynched. Often, these acts were spurred by accusations unsupported by evidence, with mobs fueled by anger and prejudice taking justice into their own hands. For many, even innocence was no shield from the noose, as mobs bypassed legal proceedings altogether. Public hangings were not just about retribution. They were tools of power, used to maintain control and societal order. Yet, they also revealed the darkest aspects of humanity, as communities cheered for spectacles of death. While hangings were one of the most well-known punishments, the Wild West's arsenal of brutality extended far beyond the noose. 14. Tar and feathering. Imagine a man dragged into a dusty town square, his screams drowned by the jeers of an eager crowd. Stripped bare, he faces a cauldron of bubbling tar. What unfolds next is the harrowing punishment of tar and feathering, a form of vigilante justice steeped in humiliation and agony. This punishment, though not originating in the Wild West, found new life on the frontier. Imported from medieval Europe and popularized during the American Revolution, tar and feathering became a favorite method for exacting mob justice without the need for legal proceedings. The process began with boiling hot tar poured onto the victim's exposed skin, causing severe burns. Next came the feathers, which adhered to the tar, transforming the victim into a grotesque figure. The true brutality lay not only in the physical pain, but in the psychological torment. Victims became living symbols of disgrace, paraded through town as objects of ridicule. The punishment often targeted those who challenged community norms or held unpopular opinions. Tax collectors, for instance, were frequent victims during periods of colonial unrest. While the physical wounds eventually healed, the public humiliation lingered far longer, leaving scars on the victim's psyche and reputation. For onlookers, these events served as cautionary tales, embedding a deep-seated fear of stepping out of line. 13. Scalping. Few punishments from the Wild West carry as much visceral horror as scalping. This gruesome practice, rooted in Native American traditions, became a symbol of the era's unrelenting brutality. What began as a tribal ritual evolved into a terrifying tool of vengeance during the violent conflicts between Native Americans and settlers. For many Native American tribes, scalping was a mark of victory and bravery. A warrior would take the scalp of their enemy as a trophy, a tangible symbol of dominance. The process was as horrifying as it sounds. A blade sliced into the scalp, separating it from the skull in a swift, excruciating motion. While some victims survived, They bore lifelong physical and psychological scars. Most, however, succumbed to infection or blood loss, making scalping a slow and agonizing death sentence. When European settlers arrived, they adopted and perpetuated the practice, using it as both retribution and a means to terrorize native populations. During periods of intense conflict, such as the French and Indian War, the practice escalated, with settlers and tribal members alike engaging in scalping as acts of retaliation. This method of punishment left deep scars, not only on individuals, but on entire communities. Survivors of scalping carried visible reminders of their ordeal, while their communities lived in constant fear of further violence. 12th. Branding. The Wild West was a harsh and untamed frontier, a place where survival often outweighed mercy and justice came swiftly, often at the cost of humanity. Among its arsenal of punishments, branding was one of the most brutal, both a physical and psychological scar that offenders carried for life. Imagine the chilling scene: a roaring fire crackling under the endless western sky, iron rods heating until they glowed a menacing orange-red, and a bound offender trembling in anticipation of the searing pain to come. Branding was far more than a simple punishment. It was an indelible mark of shame. Reserved primarily for thieves and horse rustlers, it served as both a sentence and a warning. The iron, often bearing a letter like T for thief or H for horse thief, would be pressed against the bare skin of the condemned, most commonly on visible areas such as the forehead or cheek. The act itself was quick but excruciating. Flesh hissed and smoked as the glowing metal burned deep, leaving behind a raised scar, a permanent public confession of guilt. This punishment was born of necessity in towns where jails were scarce and the threat of crime was ever present. Branding wasn't merely punitive, it was a practical means of maintaining order. The branded individual became a walking reminder of the consequences of wrongdoing, a public deterrent in a world where deterrence often outweighed rehabilitation. Yet the physical pain of branding was only the beginning. The social consequences were equally, if not more, devastating. The Spanish tickler. 11. The Spanish tickler. In the annals of history, few tools have inspired as much dread as the Spanish tickler. This deceptively innocuous name masked a device designed for one purpose: to inflict unimaginable pain. Originally a product of the dark ingenuity of medieval Europe, the tickler found its way to the lawless Wild West, where it became a tool of torture and punishment. Picture a claw-like instrument, its sharp, curved metal prongs glinting ominously in the dim light. The device was simple but devastatingly effective. Designed to shred flesh with ease, it tore through skin and muscle like paper, leaving behind horrific wounds that seldom healed properly. Victims were often stripped to expose vulnerable areas of their bodies, and the tickler was raked across their flesh with brutal force. The effects were as much psychological as they were physical. The tickler wasn't just an instrument of pain, it was a symbol of terror. The mere mention of its name could coerce confessions, even from the innocent, as the fear of its claws outweighed the desire to maintain innocence. While originally used in Europe during the Middle Ages to punish heretics and criminals, the tickler's reputation for effectiveness spread to the New World, including the Wild West. In a land lacking formal justice systems, communities turned to such extreme measures to maintain order and deter potential wrongdoers. The aftermath of the tickler's use was often as horrifying as the act itself. Victims who survived were left with deep scars, both physical and emotional. The wounds often festered, leading to infections that claimed lives slowly and painfully. Those who witnessed its use were equally haunted, their memories serving as grim reminders of the fragility of human flesh. Yet even the visceral horror of the Spanish tickler couldn't match the sheer finality of the next method of punishment: the firing squad. The firing squad. The Wild West was a place where life often hung by a thread, and for those who broke its unwritten rules, the firing squad was a swift and deadly consequence. In stark contrast to the drawn-out torments of branding or the Spanish tickler, execution by firing squad was brutally efficient, a chilling testament to the era's harsh sense of justice. Picture a dusty town square at high noon. The condemned stands bound and blindfolded, their backs straight, their breaths shallow. A line of men, rifles in hand, stands a short distance away, their faces impassive, but heavy with the gravity of the moment. The air is thick with tension, the silence broken only by the murmurs of a gathered crowd and the occasional gust of wind. In the space of a heartbeat, the silence is shattered by the deafening crack of gunfire, and the condemned falls lifeless to the ground. Reserved for crimes deemed unforgivable, treason, desertion, murder, the firing squad was a punishment both feared and respected. Some considered it a more dignified death than hanging, but this did little to ease the terror felt by those facing it. For the condemned, the moments leading up to the execution were a harrowing blend of fear and resignation, each second stretching into an eternity. The firing squad was not merely about punishment, it was about sending a message. In a time and place where lawlessness threatened to engulf entire communities, such public executions served as stark warnings to potential wrongdoers. The finality of the punishment left no room for ambiguity. Justice had been served and order maintained. Yet the psychological toll of the firing squad was not limited to the condemned. The executioners themselves often struggled with the weight of their actions. To ease their burden, a common practice was to load one rifle with a blank cartridge, ensuring that no individual could be certain they had fired the fatal shot. Even so, the echoes of the gunfire lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of their role in ending a human life. Spectators, too, were affected. Watching someone's life extinguished by a hail of bullets left an indelible mark, a stark reminder of mortality and the thin line between order and chaos. The firing squad may have offered a swift end, but its impact reverberated far beyond the moment of execution. In the grim tapestry of frontier justice, each punishment carried its own brand of horror. Whether through the searing pain of branding, the flesh-tearing claws of the Spanish tickler, or the finality of a firing squad, these methods underscored the harsh realities of a world where survival often came at the cost of humanity. 9. Ear cropping and nose slitting. In the Wild West, the weight of punishment lingered long after the act itself, etched visibly onto the bodies of those who suffered. Ear cropping and nose slitting were among the most brutal and dehumanizing methods employed. These punishments weren't just about physical pain. They were about marking individuals for life, ensuring their guilt would be on public display forever. Criminals subjected to these procedures became walking reminders of the harsh justice system, their mutilated features proclaiming their supposed transgressions to everyone they encountered. The process itself was as horrifying as its aftermath. Victims were bound and rendered defenseless, their faces and ears at the mercy of the enforcer. Cropping involved slicing off part or all of the ear, leaving jagged scars or grotesque deformities. Similarly, nose slitting, a cut made along the length of the nose, left a disfiguring mark. The wounds bled profusely, and without proper medical care, they often became infected, adding further suffering. These punishments were not reserved for only the most heinous crimes. Petty thieves, debtors, and even individuals accused of minor offences could face such irreversible fates. Women were not exempt either. In fact, they were often targeted for accusations of adultery or witchcraft, reflecting the deeply ingrained gender inequalities of the time. For these women, ear cropping or nose slitting wasn't just about punishment. It was about social ostracization, a permanent reminder of their alleged moral failings. In an era where communities often took justice into their own hands, these acts were performed publicly, meant to serve as both a warning and entertainment for the onlookers. While the physical scars were horrifying, the psychological damage was just as enduring. Victims were shunned by their peers, their disfigurement a symbol of disgrace. 8. Flogging or whipping. Few punishments in the Wild West were as publicly degrading and physically agonizing as flogging. In a world governed by frontier justice, the sight of someone tied to a wooden post, their back laid bare for the lash, was a common and harrowing spectacle. The whip, a crude but effective instrument of pain, became a symbol of authority, law, and often unchecked cruelty. The accused would stand exposed before a silent crowd, bound and awaiting their sentence. The whip, often made from leather and designed to inflict maximum pain, would crack against their skin with an echo that carried through the gathered townsfolk. Each lash tore through flesh, leaving deep welts, bloodied stripes, and eventually permanent scars. For the victim, the humiliation of such a public punishment could be worse than the physical agony. Being flogged in front of one's peers not only broke the body, but also crushed the spirit. Flogging wasn't reserved for only the most serious crimes. Offences like theft, public drunkenness, or unpaid fines could lead to this punishment. Often, it disproportionately targeted the vulnerable, drifters, the impoverished, and those deemed undesirable by the local authorities. The severity of the flogging varied widely, depending on the whims of the enforcer or the community's collective anger. Some victims endured a handful of lashes, while others faced dozens, their backs reduced to raw, bloody pulp. The purpose of flogging was twofold: to punish the offender and to serve as a deterrent. Onlookers were reminded of the consequences of defying societal norms, reinforcing the rigid structure of frontier life. 7. Burning at the stake. Few punishments are as viscerally terrifying as being burned alive. In the Wild West, this gruesome execution method was reserved for the most heinous accusations: witchcraft, heresy, or treason. To burn someone at the stake wasn't merely to end their life. It was to erase their existence in the most painful and public way possible. The flames consumed not only the body, but also any trace of dignity or humanity the victim may have hoped to preserve. The condemned were tied to a sturdy wooden post, surrounded by kindling, dry wood, and other flammable materials. As the fire was lit, smoke filled the air, and the crowd gathered to witness the execution would often be a mix of curious onlookers and those driven by a macabre sense of justice. The crackling of flames and the victim's screams created a chilling atmosphere, searing the memory into the minds of all present. While the practice of burning at the stake had its roots in medieval Europe, it made its way into the Wild West during periods of lawlessness. Accusations leading to such punishments were often fueled by superstition, fear, or personal vendettas. The lack of a structured legal system meant communities frequently acted as judge, jury, and executioner, leading to many unjust deaths. 6. Drowning in a barrel. Of all the punishments in the Wild West, few combined psychological torment and physical suffering as effectively as drowning in a barrel. This cruel method forced victims to confront their mortality in a slow, agonizing fashion, surrounded by water that would eventually become their grave. The punishment was as intimate as it was horrifying, with every gasp and struggle visible to onlookers. The condemned were bound and submerged inch by inch into a water-filled barrel, the rising liquid bringing with it an unbearable sense of dread. The process wasn't just about the act of drowning, it was about the anticipation, the slow realization that death was imminent. Victims often struggled against their restraints, their terror palpable to the watching crowd. This punishment was typically reserved for betrayals or crimes that struck at the heart of community trust. Offences like treachery, theft, or moral transgressions could result in such a fate. The intimacy of the act, performed in close quarters and witnessed by a small, tight-knit audience, made it all the more chilling. For the victim, there was no escape, no reprieve, and no dignity in death. Despite its brutality, drowning in a barrel was seen as an effective deterrent. The slow, methodical nature of the punishment ensured that witnesses would not soon forget the sight. Yet, even as the Wild West transitioned into a more structured society with formal legal systems, 5. Running the gauntlet, a path of pain. Running the gauntlet was not the daring challenge its name might suggest. Instead, it was a form of mob justice that turned punishment into a spectacle of pain and humiliation. Imagine being dragged to a clearing, surrounded by a jeering crowd, and forced to confront two long lines of armed individuals. The gauntlet wasn't just a test of endurance, it was an ordeal of survival. Victims, whether bound or coerced, were forced to run between two parallel lines of people, armed with clubs, whips, and improvised weapons. Each person in the line had one job: to strike the runner as hard as possible. The goal was not just to punish, but to break the victim physically and mentally. The brutality of this punishment left lasting marks, both visible and unseen. victims often emerged with broken bones, deep gashes, and flesh torn apart by relentless blows. The lucky ones survived but bore scars that would remind them, and anyone who saw them, of their transgressions. Many didn't survive at all, collapsing under the weight of their injuries or succumbing to their wounds soon after. This punishment wasn't reserved for hardened criminals, petty thieves, those who defied societal norms, or individuals who simply fell out of favor with influential townsfolk could find themselves facing the gauntlet. It was less about justice and more about reinforcing the community's power, ensuring that dissent and disobedience were met with severe consequences. Yet for some, running the gauntlet was just the beginning. Those who survived the ordeal often faced even harsher punishments, such as horse dragging, which promised even greater agony. 4. Horse dragging, frontier retribution. While the gauntlet was a communal display of punishment, horse dragging was an execution of vengeance tailored for a specific crime: horse theft. In the Wild West, horses were more than transportation. They were lifelines. To steal one was to rob someone of their livelihood, their ability to travel, and sometimes their very survival. To ensure the gravity of this crime was felt, horse dragging became one of the most brutal forms of punishment. The accused, guilty or not, would be tied, typically by their ankles or wrists, to the very horse they were accused of stealing. At the crack of a whip or the shout of a command, the horse would bolt, dragging the helpless victim across unforgiving terrain. The aftermath of horse dragging was almost always gruesome. Victims suffered shredded skin, shattered bones, and fatal head injuries. The punishment often ended in death, either from the injuries themselves or from being dragged for miles until the body was lifeless. Horse dragging wasn't just about punishing the individual, it was a spectacle meant to deter others. Communities often gathered to witness the event, the sight of a bloodied and broken body serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of crime. It was justice through fear, a method of ensuring order in a lawless land. However, the lack of formal trials meant that innocence was no guarantee of safety. The water test, a trial of superstition. Among the punishments of the Wild West, the water test, commonly referred to as dunking, stands out as a macabre blend of fear and superstition. Rooted in old-world practices, this method found new life in the lawless frontier, where accusations often carried more weight than evidence. The premise of the water test was both absurd and terrifying. An accused individual, bound hand and foot, would be taken to the edge of a river or pond. There, they would face a horrifying dilemma. If they floated, they were guilty, as their buoyancy was seen as proof of supernatural interference. If they sank, they were innocent. But the price of proving their innocence was often death by drowning. The physical experience of the water test was harrowing. Submerged repeatedly in icy water, victims fought to catch their breath between dunkings. The cold would seep into their bodies, causing muscles to cramp and lungs to scream for oxygen. Hypothermia set in quickly, and the mental toll was equally devastating. Panic gripped the mind, as survival became an excruciating battle against the elements and the mob overseeing the punishment. The contradictions of this punishment were cruelly ironic. Surviving the ordeal often meant being declared guilty and facing further punishment, while sinking to one's death might absolve the victim of wrongdoing, but at a cost that no one could repay. The water test wasn't just about punishing the individual, it was a tool of control. By turning justice into a spectacle of fear, communities reinforced their power and ensured submission from the populace. The test served as a reminder that in the Wild West, justice wasn't about fairness. It was about maintaining order, often at the expense of humanity. 2. Stocks and pillories, a public show of shame and pain. In the dusty town squares of the Wild West, amidst the saloons and general stores, stood wooden structures that symbolized a different kind of justice: stocks and pillories. Unlike the life-threatening punishments of the frontier, this method aimed not at physical destruction, but at psychological and social obliteration. The stocks and pillories represented a form of punishment that preyed on dignity, turning petty crimes into public spectacles. The mechanics were deceptively simple. An offender, convicted of minor infractions like theft or public drunkenness, was locked into a wooden frame, often with their head and hands trapped. Positioned in the center of the town, they became a living exhibit of disgrace. Vulnerable and immobilized, the convicted were left at the mercy of the townsfolk, who often treated the occasion not as a means of justice, but as a source of amusement. The humiliation didn't stop at mere gawking. Crowds would hurl rotten food, mud, or even waste at the helpless individual, adding layers of physical discomfort to the mental anguish. Some would go further, throwing stones or prodding with sticks, escalating the punishment from humiliation to outright harm. Though stocks and pillories weren't designed to kill, they frequently left behind bruises, cuts, and deeper emotional wounds. The psychological toll was immense. To stand powerless as neighbors, friends, or even strangers ridiculed and degraded, you stripped away any sense of self-respect. For many, the echoes of laughter and jeers reverberated long after their release, leaving scars not visible, but deeply felt. This public shaming wasn't just a form of correction, it was a social weapon, a reminder of the consequences of defying community norms. Yet, stocks and pillories had another insidious dimension. While the official purpose was to maintain order through fear of disgrace, the mob often took control. Public anger could escalate, transforming the punishment into a frenzy of abuse. What began as a communal lesson could easily spiral into a brutal ordeal, with the victim bearing the brunt of collective frustrations. Though this punishment avoided the fatal consequences of others on this list, it left victims broken in spirit. The emotional scars often lingered longer than physical injuries. Stocks and pillories exemplified a unique cruelty of frontier justice, maintaining order through public humiliation. But as cruel as public shaming was, it paled in comparison to the horror of the Wild West's most terrifying punishment, one that ensured there was no escape. 1. Buried alive. The ultimate frontier. Nightmare. In the eerie silence of the Wild West nights, tales of unimaginable punishments circulated among townsfolk, but none struck more fear than the prospect of being buried alive. This method of execution was rare, but left a chilling mark on the psyche of those who dared to defy the harsh rules of frontier society. Reserved for the most despised criminals, traitors, informants, or those who committed unspeakable acts, this punishment symbolized the absolute authority of vigilante justice. The process itself was as horrifying as the outcome. Victims were typically bound, their movements restricted to ensure they could not fight back or escape. They were placed in shallow graves, the deceptive shallowness designed to prolong their suffering. With every shovelful of dirt, their world grew darker and more suffocating. The final moments were a blend of raw terror and resignation, each breath a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. For the victim, the psychological torment often surpassed the physical agony. The knowledge of being buried alive, a fate from which there was no reprieve, was a cruelty few could endure without breaking down completely. Each gasp for air grew weaker as soil pressed against their body, turning the grave into a chamber of slow, agonizing death. The act of burying someone alive wasn't merely about punishing a crime. It served as a grim warning to the community, a stark reminder of what awaited those who stepped too far out of line. In a land where the rule of law was often tenuous at best, vigilante groups wielded this punishment as a tool of fear and control. Their message was clear: defy the rules and face a fate worse than death. This method also carried a dark symbolic weight. By burying someone alive, the executioners severed the victim's connection to the world of the living, condemning them to an isolating, suffocating end. Unlike hangings or shootings, which were swift and visible, burial alive was a hidden punishment. The victim's cries for help, muffled by the earth, became haunting echoes in the minds of those who witnessed or even participated. The psychological impact extended beyond the victim. For witnesses, the sheer brutality of the act left an indelible impression, reinforcing a climate of fear and submission. Parents would whisper warnings to their children, neighbors would second-guess acts of rebellion, and criminals would think twice before challenging the fragile order of frontier towns. Though infrequent, the legacy of being buried alive became one of the most enduring symbols of the Wild West's extremes of justice. In a world where survival depended on adhering to unwritten rules, this punishment epitomized the ruthless measures communities were willing to take to protect themselves. As the sun set over the rugged landscapes of the Wild West, stories of such punishments served as chilling reminders of a time when justice often blurred into cruelty, and survival sometimes meant accepting the unthinkable.